Hi, welcome along to Steve Wright's True Crime Podcast. And today's guest is an author by the name of Daniel Smith. Hi, Daniel. How are you?
I'm good, thank you.
Great to have you on. I saw your book being publicised quite a while ago now. Obviously, keep an eye on Amazon for anything to do with the notorious Kray brothers, obviously because of my link. And you've released a book called A Very British Cover-Up, The Peer and the Gangster. And of course, anyone who knows anything to do with the Krays or knows a lot about the Kray twin story will know that in 1964, the Sunday Mirror ran a front page story headlined Peer and a Gangster, Yard Enquiry. Now, while the article withheld the name of the subjects, the newspaper reported that the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police had ordered an investigation into an alleged homosexual relationship between a household name from the House of Lords and a leading figure in the London underworld. Lord Boothby, of course, was the Conservative Lord in question, and Ronnie Kray was the infamous gangster. And that is the subject of the subject matter of the book that Daniel has written. So, Daniel, before we look into that book, let's go back to how you became an author. We've had a few authors on the show. I interviewed Wensley Clarkson only last week. Good friend of mine, Wensley, who's done a lot of fantastic crime books, and people can look up that interview on the channel if they want. We had Steve Richards on from Newcastle, who's done a few about the Northeast gangsters. So this one's a completely different slant. But where did your taste and enjoyment for writing come from?
It's been a bit of a winding path, really. I wrote my first book about, I guess, 11 or 12 years ago now. It was about Sherlock Holmes. It's a very different subject matter. And I've written about 30 odd non-fiction books, all sorts of subjects, lots of biographies, a bit of history, some economics, even some philosophy, all sorts of things. So I have lots of interests, and sometimes I just follow whatever takes my fancy, really. And this one came about. So I grew up on the edge of South London, and I knew about the Krays when I was growing up, and I read some of the Charlie Krays book and all those kind of things when I was in my teens. So I was familiar with the Krays. But about 10 years ago, I was asked to write a history of the Second World War Dig for Victory campaign. So again, a completely different sort of subject, but that was really my route to this book, bizarrely. So I knew about the Krays. I didn't know anything about Bob Boothby. I was born in the 70s, so he didn't really come on my radar at all, really. And I was researching this book about the Second World War Dig for Victory campaign, and I came across his name, had a little bit of an investigation into his background, because he was at the Ministry of Food during the war, so he had some involvement in that campaign. And it was while I was doing that I got these first kind of whispers that he had this bizarre connection to the Krays in the 60s, and it just seemed so odd and out of keeping with all the other stuff that I was reading about him at that time. But then I kept an eye on things, researched more, found out about his long-term affair with Harold Macmillan's wife, got the impression that there was more to this man than Dig for Victory anyway.
Yeah. It was a fascinating period, wasn't it? I mean, the government had already had its first big scandal anyway, because the Profumo affair, which was explosive case. Anyone who hasn't read about that or seen anything about it, Google it. It's Christine Keeler and the minister, and again another fascinating case. So 60s, but they had already big explosive case all over the newspapers, and its scandal is never good for politicians. But then this article breaking in 1964. It was a strange article. It just it grasped the public, and of course everybody was wanting to know who it was, who was the gangster, who was the politician. So tell us a little bit about that, and what effect that had on the government and Boothby.
Yeah, well, I think, and not only had Profumo only happened the year before, but the year before that as well, there'd been another scandal, the John Vassall spy scandal, where there's a kind of mid-ranking civil servant who'd been posted out in Moscow, and he was gay, and he'd basically been caught in a classic Soviet honey trap, and they got photos of him at a party, and as a result blackmailed him into spying for them. So he'd been spying for the basically throughout the whole of the 50s. So the government really was coming off the back of those two scandals over the previous 2 years. And the net effect of that was Profumo had seen the end of Macmillan's time as Prime Minister, and Douglas Hume had come in to replace him. And he was meant to be the steadying hand that was going to take the Conservatives through to the next election, which was due at the end of '64. And so they just really didn't want another scandal. And the Sunday Mirror, the chief crime reporter there was a guy called Norman Lucas. And he knew everybody in the Met, and he knew everybody on the wrong side of the law as well. And he picked up whispers from his Met informants that the Krays had been under surveillance since the beginning of '64, and they'd been spotted basically hanging out with Boothby a lot. So he knew that there was a story there. They didn't name either Kray or Boothby in that original story. But it wasn't long. Everybody in Westminster and everybody on Fleet Street pretty much knew that it was Boothby and Kray. And at the time, in this day and age, everyone knows who Ronnie Kray is, and fewer people know who Lord Boothby is. But at the time, it was very much the other way around. Lord Boothby was on the TV and the radio all the time. He was sort of the first celebrity television politician, really. Churchill used to call him the MP for television, in quite a scathing way. So Boothby was a huge name, and as it emerged over the following weeks that he was involved and implicated in all of this, it really did have a big impact, not only among the public, but even more so, because the public still were kept in the dark as the true identity, even though there were the rumours. But within the Conservatives, first of all, there was a real panic that this was going to be the end of not only Douglas Hume's time as Prime Minister, but possibly the party out of government for years to come, because they just had too many of these scandals, one on top of the other.
People sitting at home would probably want to know how on earth somebody as high up in the Conservative Party and government would come across somebody like Ronnie Kray. But of course, the seeds were sown, I believe, the year earlier. It was 1963, I think it was, when Lord Boothby started an affair with an East End cat burglar called Leslie Holt.
Yeah, well, that he seems to have been the route in. There was it's quite possible that Boothby and Leslie Holt had been known to each other maybe even earlier than that, as early as 1960, according to some reports, but it's difficult to know exactly when they met. But yeah, basically Holt was this cat burglar. He was sometimes a driver for the Krays as well. They lived in the same flats in Hackney for a while. So Holt himself said that he introduced Boothby to the Krays. Other people suggest that the Krays had probably clocked Boothby hanging around with Holt and had their eye on him before that anyway. But yeah, because of this relationship, that's how the association began.
Yeah, I mean, the Krays were very smart in the sense that they had started off in a snooker club in Mile End, which they'd acquired off the previous owner. And then, they built up an empire of spielers, and essentially these spielers and clubs that people would, they're probably envisaging, huge nightclubs as we're seeing now. But a lot of these bars and clubs that were open were actually in upstairs flats of maybe businesses or even people's houses, and there weren't pubs and clubs as such as we would think of now. So, but what they did was they obviously were making money out of those particular rackets. They were also running protection rackets. They had, as John Pearson called it in his book, a profession of violence. They would go across and, essentially speak to somebody who maybe carried out a robbery or a burglary, and essentially they would demand their money. They were thieves' ponces, if you like. I think that's what's really developed over the last 25, 30 years. The truth has come out from a lot of other villains that the Krays weren't particularly good at crime, but they were very good at violence, and they had this vice-like grip over the East End. But they moved into the West End, and this was where the association really came with with celebrities and with politicians, because they got into the gambling side of things. The gambling laws were only recently changed in that period, and they were essentially allowed to open casinos. There was a link with certain American mafioso, and with these gambling clubs came high profile celebrities, but also came high profile politicians, and this is where a lot of these introductions took place.
Yeah, and Boothby was a lifelong gambling addict, really. He was always in debt. He came from a very well-to-do background, but he was Eton and Oxford educated, and he appeared to be of the elite, but he always had money problems because he was such a ferocious gambler, and he lived a high life, gambler, drinker, probably lots of other recreational substances as well over the years, and a pretty exotic private life. So I think he was drawn to that, the kind of certainly the West End clubs, but I think also he quite liked. In fact, during the war, he talked about going to the East End when the East End was suffering the Blitz, and meeting the people there, and he liked being around ordinary, normal, earthy people. And as time went on, he also liked being around criminals, it turned out. So the Krays, in lots of ways, they just gave so much that appealed to him. And I think the twins as well, and particularly Ronnie, had this idea that if they could befriend people like Boothby, and kind of get into that establishment setup, the establishment always looked after each other. And if they could get a part of that, then they would also have some form of protection. And in many ways, they were right, at least for several years.
Yeah, normally one misdemeanor on one side of the house, on the Conservative side of the house, would mean that the Labour side of the house would be able to attack them and certainly gain a major advantage in politics. But unfortunately for Labour, Tom Driberg, who was a senior Labour MP, was also homosexual and also associated with the Kray twins.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, this was so that the story came out in the Sunday Mirror, which was essentially a Labour supporting paper, and there'd been various things going on at the time. So senior members of the editorial staff were on holiday and that kind of stuff. So they didn't go through the normal processes they probably would have done of checking a story with their political allies before running with it. But they printed it thinking Harold Wilson and the Labour Party were going to love this, and this would be like the final nail in the coffin of the Conservatives. But immediately it set alarm bells ringing there, because, like you say, Driberg, who'd actually been chairman of the Labour Party as recently as 58, so only 6 years earlier, was up to his neck in it with Boothby as well. And indeed, there were some reports that suggested that Driberg had been the one who'd actually introduced Boothby to the Krays. And I think it almost certainly was through Leslie Holt that the association began. But certainly Driberg was socialising with them. He was friends with the theatre director and film director Joan Littlewood, who was based in East London. He'd been friends with her for many, many years. But she worked with Barbara Windsor, and there's the story goes that there was a film that Barbara Windsor was starring in that Joan Littlewood directed, and they wanted to use a nightclub for one of the scenes, and so Barbara Windsor contacted the Krays, who she knew socially, and that's how that connection began. And then via Joan Littlewood, Tom Driberg came into that circle as well. And yeah, he was, if anything, even more reckless in his life in general than Boothby, which was quite an achievement, really.
Yeah, the film you're talking about, of course, is Sparrows Can't Sing. Originally a 1960s play, and you're right, it was directed by Joan Littlewood from a story by Stephen Lewis, I think, but it's still available on DVD, so anybody who's interested in seeing what the inside of one of the Krays nightclubs used to look like can certainly find that out. And there's a couple of cameo roles by some of the firm members on there, which I find fascinating. So we haven't really touched on it yet. I'm sure you touch on it in the book. We know now, we've established that Ronnie Kray and Tom Driberg and Bob Boothby were friends, whether it was via Littlewood or Holt, that's open to debate. But what was what was the arrangement? What was Ronnie Kray providing for these MPs?
So essentially, he was hosting them at parties where young men and some of them very young, as in late teens and into their early 20s, were invited, and according to who you listen to, either invited cordially or told, Ronnie wants you at the party, make sure you're there. And basically these young lads were providing sexual favors to the two politicians, amongst many other guests, including other well-known people by all accounts, although it's very difficult to get the names, or anybody to go on the record with the names of anyone else at those parties. But yeah, so it was quite a bleak picture, particularly the aspect of coercion, this sort of idea that there were people there who, young men who probably didn't want to say no to Ronnie Kray anyway, and then were presented by these figures of the establishment in their 60s by this stage, people that they might have recognized from the TV if they recognized them at all, but certainly people who were seemingly extremely powerful, much richer than they were, making demands on them that it was very difficult to refuse, really.
The Krays, of course, had moved out of the family home in Valence Road and had relocated to Cedra Court, which is where a lot of these parties were held.
Yeah.
I think it was known as the Blue Lagoon. Ron's apartment, if you like, or flat, where he would entertain these parties, and he lived obviously next to Reg in a separate apartment as well. So it was, I mean, when you read about it and hear about it, it is quite unnerving. Did your research find anything, to link them with, anything more illegal? I mean, we see a lot of rumors and a lot of people insinuating that the Krays were involved in trafficking, underage children or underage boys. Did your research find anything out in that?
Did I find anything concrete that I could put in the book? No, I heard a lot of rumours. I did a lot of appeals through the media, all sorts of media, local media in East London, up in Scotland where Boothby was an MP. There's obviously been lots of historical allegations about things that went on in Jersey, and I know the Krays and Boothby were both in Jersey at various points. But in terms of anybody going on the record, no. One really interesting source never knew Boothby, but he knew Driberg in the 70s, and this guy basically had ended up working on what was known as the meat rack in Piccadilly Circus, which was essentially where the rent boys around that area all congregated, and he seemed to doubt whether Driberg was particularly keen on much younger than late teens. However, there was also evidence, there was the independent inquiry into child sex abuse last year, and there was a statement from MI5 given at that point where they were told in 1981, so after Driberg had died, I think he died in 76, so that's 5 years afterwards, that there had been allegations that they were aware of that Driberg was interested in younger people even than late teens. And there was also a police officer who sadly died. He made some allegations in 2015 that Driberg had been under Met surveillance, and there had been escapees from Felton Borstal, as it then was, who'd been trapped, basically ending up in his flat, and several of them had made allegations, and there'd been a move to get some criminal action going, but it was rejected by the Director of Public Prosecutions at the time. So that's as firm as it goes on Driberg. And in fact, on Boothby, the evidence was even less. It seems like he liked the sort of late teens upwards. That was his taste. But I never came across anything formal other than rumours, which are often secondhand rumours, that he was involved in anything other than that. And then in terms of the Krays, because obviously the Krays themselves have, it's been suggested, were involved with younger people, nobody went on record, put it that way. So
well, I mean, I've heard countless stories and rumors over the years. I think a lot of it's there really just to tarnish the legend. I've never spoken to anybody who certainly suggested that they were trafficking, underage, boys in particular. I've heard rumors that they'd slept together, which again is ludicrous. And I think it's also ludicrous to suggest that, that Reg would assault Francis or abuse Francis. I think what became clear in time as they served their sentences, we always knew that Ron was homosexual. I think, Reg was a twin. And I think the difference between Ron and Reg was that, Ron was openly gay, whereas Reg was more of a closet. He was always battling his sexual demon, and, he spent a lot of his life battling himself, but also having to control Ron, who was, of course, mentally ill. So it's a fascinating, it's a fascinating story, one which I think which will never be repeated. But so many little different tangents you could go off on. I mean, the Boothby one was interesting as well. Again, I'm not sure whether you cover it in the book, but, a lot of stories about his perversions. I mean, you've already said he was having an affair with a woman. So, I mean, you would presume that, Lord Boothby was probably bisexual.
Yeah.
But he had a lot of perversions. And I think, without going into it too graphically, he used to lie under a glass table in Cedar Court, whilst masturbating, whilst young lads were, defecating above him. That was one of the stories that was quite common in the Kray circles and amongst, Kray members.
Yeah. And again, I've heard those stories, and I think there's a good chance that they're credible and true. Some of those ones you'll never know by the nature of a story like this. You're filling in the gap sometimes because there's not documented records, obviously, of this sort of stuff. But yeah, and certainly Boothby he had voracious appetites. He was certainly bisexual. He had his cousin was the journalist Ludovic Kennedy, the journalist and writer, and he reckoned that he'd fathered at least 3 children out of wedlock. There was a strong rumour for many, many years, which continues to this day, that he was actually the father of Sarah Macmillan, who was Harold Macmillan's daughter. I'm slightly sceptical about that because of other information that I've received, but Harold Macmillan himself didn't know for sure. He visited Boothby in his flat late on in their life and basically asked him outright, and Boothby said, "No, I'm absolutely not her father." But all of those sorts of mysteries will continue. And then bizarrely, just a few years after the Boothby saga, he ended up marrying a very glamorous Sardinian woman who was 34 years younger than him. And they had I can't remember how long they were married for, near enough 20 years, which was supposedly a very happy marriage until Boothby died in 1986. So, he was into everything.
Yeah, no, there's no doubt about that. He lived life to the full. Of that, there's no doubt. One of the stories that I got from Charlie Kray, before he died, was that that the Krays did have a lot of incriminating photographs and cinefilm. Of course, cinefilm was still relatively new back then, but the Krays did have a cine camera. We placed the footage on our documentary, The Krays. When the day the Krays came to town, it was actual film footage, which has been seen on other documentaries where we put the full footage on there. But the rumours were abound for years that the Krays actually had a get out of jail free card. So a lot of these parties that were taking place at Cedar Court were filmed for posterity, shall we say, or photos were taken of people in incriminating positions. However, when the doors got kicked in 1968 and the twins and the brother and the firm were arrested, the woman who actually had a lot of this incriminating stuff was actually one of the relatives to the Krays, and they were told to get rid of it, i.e. move it to another place.
Right.
In a quick hurried phone call from someone in prison. And taken it upon themselves to, rather than move it from one place to another, they stuck it into a bin in the backyard and burnt it. And a lot of this incriminating stuff, footage, photographs, etc., disappeared forever. and with that, the opportunity, the Krays had hoped to get themselves, either a lesser sentence or out of prison altogether by embarrassing all of these, highbrow people, went up in flames. So, I mean, did you ever hear about them filming stuff or anything like that? Or
yeah, I mean, that was part of the problem. And when the scandal first blew up, there were rumours going around, the cabinet, the Conservative cabinet, were having secret meetings about this, and they heard whispers that there were more incriminating photos to be had. Clearly they have never turned up, so either they never existed, or, like you say, they were disposed of along the way. But it also occurs to me that to an extent, you don't need that evidence if you have the threat that you might have it as well. And certainly I think that worked for a number of years for Boothby and Driberg, that they lived under this kind of not knowing for sure quite what evidence there was out there of them. And yeah, to an extent, I'd be surprised if there wasn't documentation going on, because Ronnie liked to document things in photographs. When he liked to be seen with people and make use of photographs. So I'd be surprised if there wasn't any evidence along the way. But it is this mystery of where it's gone. There was a rumor that Leslie Holt had suggested he'd put some stuff away with a solicitor at one point. But again, it's never come to light. So I don't know. If it's still out there and it's discovered one day, then I'd love to see it, put it that way.
Me too, to a degree anyway. I think I'd like somebody else to see it first, and then.
Well, yeah, that might be the way to do it. Yeah, yeah. I'd like to know who was in them.
Me too. Getting back to the story, then get back to where we started. Obviously, this story had come about Boothby's underworld associations. I think it had come to the attention of the Sunday Express originally, which of course is a conservative supporting paper. But then, as you quite rightly said, a Labour supporting paper, the Sunday Mirror, broke it. And I think that, although they decided not to name the MP or the gangster, I think it was German magazine Stern, I think, which eventually broke the name. So yeah, now we've got this situation. It's all over the front page of the Daily Mirror. Everyone's asking who it is, and most people in the know do know who it is. But then it suddenly hits a brick wall, because neither of the major political parties really have an interest in publicising this. So Cecil King, who was the owner of the paper, then comes under pressure from the leadership, doesn't he, to drop the matter?
Yeah, and it, in the end, makes this grovelling apology to Boothby, and it was specifically to Boothby rather than Ronnie, and paid him £40,000 out of court, which would be somewhere in the region of 800,000, $1 million today. So it was a huge payout. And really, there were a couple of things that really undermined the story. First of all, the Sunday Mirror had the makings of the story, but they didn't have the detail right. So it was this assertion that there was a definite relationship between Kray and Boothby, which they just could not prove, and a lot of the evidence suggests never existed, that they were not sexually interested in each other at all. But Ronnie Kray was quite dismissive of Boothby as a potential suitor. And Boothby was he was in his mid-60s by then. He wasn't he was no Adonis by that stage of life. So the Sunday Mirror didn't have the story quite right. And also very early on, before any of the names had been mentioned, the Met Police Commissioner, Chief Commissioner, made a public statement in which he basically undermined the whole thing, said there was no such inquiry, and that they would not be discussing the matter any further, and basically gave the impression that the Sunday Mirror was barking up the wrong tree entirely, when really they were not barking up entirely the wrong tree, but they were maybe on the wrong side of the tree, and they needed to peer around the corner a bit more and get their details a little bit further in line. But really, once the Chief Commissioner had made his statement, it kind of made it impossible for them to carry on with the story. They ran a front page the following week, but that was the end of it. And then the political parties became involved. So you had the Conservatives who were having their discussions, and they seem to have adopted a line that they wanted to know what the newspapers had, not just the Sunday Mirror, but there were suggestions the Mirror was sharing evidence with other papers, and they engaged the police really to go and put pressure on various newspaper editors, which was not really legal. I mean, the Met should not be taking orders from a political party, even if they're in government, to be pressurising the media. But it also had another side to it, because 2 years earlier, after the John Vassell spy scandal, there'd been a public inquiry, and there were 2 journalists who refused to reveal their sources for stories they'd written about the case then. And they were imprisoned, and those were the first 2 journalists in British history who had gone to jail for not revealing their sources. So all of those people who were in the cabinet at the time would have known that, and known what sort of pressure they were bringing to bear on Fleet Street. But they didn't want to do much to help Boothby directly. I think they knew they didn't want to go picking around his life too much. And so he asked one of the members of the cabinet if they could advise on legal advice for him, provide him with contacts for any lawyers. And they basically came back and said no. So they were going to keep silent on the story and hope that it went away, but they weren't really going to do anything to directly help Boothby. And that's where then you had this very strange situation where the Labour Party came in, and there was a chap called Arnold Goodman, who later became Lord Goodman, who was essentially Harold Wilson's chief legal advisor at the time, and then during his early years in government, and Gerald Gardner, who would become Lord Chancellor under Harold Wilson by the end of the year. And astonishingly for these 2 kind of Labour heavyweights, they went and searched Boothby out, took on his case, aggressively fought it. They told Boothby to make a statement to the Times, and he wrote a letter denying it all flatly. And Arnold Goodman was really the greatest media lawyer of his age, and he contacted the Mirror people directly and brought his pressure to bear. And that was it for the story. Just, it disappeared, and not only disappeared, but then Boothby got this 40,000, although how much of that he kept and how much of it found its way to the twins, we'll never know for sure either.
Yeah, very interesting. I mean, the Krays might not have benefited financially, but they certainly benefited in other ways, because other newspapers became less willing to cover the Krays. And of course, that continued for the next few years.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was one of the sort of unpredictable aspects of this, I think, for the politicians at the time. The Krays were starting to come onto the public radar, but only very gently at that time. But then by the end of the decade, they're these major public figures, and now you've then got these politicians as well that know that they are kind of implicated in having let them get away 5 or 6 years earlier. And so, yeah, I think that's another dimension to it, which in retrospect was pretty serious.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, of course, the Krays, for those of you who are, not Kray aficionados, went on to, of course, kill George Cornell. Ronnie Kray walked into the Blind Beggar pub in the East End of London at point blank range, shot him dead in front of witnesses. Jack the Hat, who was a member of the Kray firm, but who had failed to carry out an order and taken payment for it, was stabbed to death at a party in Evering Road by Reggie Kray. And they also helped Frank the Mad Axeman Mitchell escape from Dartmoor prison. They had him holed up, in the build-up to Christmas. They were going to try and get him a pardon from prison or a release date. And because he became uncontrollable, they had it arranged for him to be killed. And Jack the Hat's body, Frank Mitchell's body, of course, had never been found. The Krays doors went in, of course, in 1969. Nipper Reid and the guys from Tintagel House eventually managed to get enough people to come forward. The Blind Beggar barmaid, of course, was the key witness, to come forward and make statements. And then eventually some of the firm then turned Queen's evidence in 1969. Justice Melford Stevenson sentenced the Krays to life in prison with a recommendation that they both serve 30 years, and the Kray firm total as well, it hit the 100 mark for different, different sentences that were handed down. So, one hell of a story, and the book, which we've got behind us here, The Peer and the Gangster, is a fascinating read by Daniel. What happened with the other protagonists in the book then, Daniel? Tell us first of all what happened to Leslie Holt, the cat burglar.
So his story was pretty sad, really. He's continued in reasonably low level crime, and he ended up dying in very mysterious circumstances in the late 70s. He was ostensibly having an operation on his foot, and done by a Harley Street doctor, and seemingly had an overdose of anaesthetic and died. But the whole thing was very mysterious, including what the nature of his relationship was with the doctor. There were all sorts of rumours that this doctor would tip him off about clients who he might go and burgle and all that kind of stuff, and might well have in the end felt that Holt knew too much. There's always rumours that, like with the Krays 30-year sentence, that there were these people who did know too much about too many establishment figures, and that they were slowly taken off the scene. So yeah, the Holt one is another mystery, and whether we'll ever get to the bottom of it, who knows.
Lord Boothby.
Lord Boothby, he essentially got away with it, but I would say his life was tainted, by it until his death in 1986. He still kept on appearing on TV and radio throughout all that time. He wrote extensively for the papers as well. He married this Sardinian woman and ostensibly lived out quite a happy last few years. But I think he lived under that shadow of this secret, and the fact that he never knew for sure that there wasn't this stash of evidence somewhere that was going to be produced one day that would bring his name down again. And he slowly broke off the association with the Krays. I think the year after, in '65, when the Krays were arrested for the Hideaway case, he stood up in the House of Lords and went against all parliamentary etiquette and made an appeal on their behalf directly that they ought to be released on bail pending trial, which brought notoriety down on him by, in terms of his fellow members of the House of Lords. They all thought that was an awful thing he'd done, and he obviously felt under pressure to represent for the Krays over those few years. But then as time went on, he seemed to withdraw from them to a certain extent. Driberg, on the other hand, even into the 70s, he was still writing prodigious number of letters to the Home Office, specifically asking for better conditions and better terms on all sorts of issues for the twins. So yeah, I think both of them essentially got away with it because they both died before the story ever really came out, but they paid a price.
Tom Driberg, what happened to him?
So he died in 76, 10 or 12 years later. He ended up, he had a flat in the Barbican in his later years, and he was a kind of slightly sad, lonely individual. He'd married a woman several years earlier. He had a 20-year marriage. I think they married in the mid-50s. He never had any interest in a heterosexual relationship, so it really was a marriage for show, but it was a deeply unhappy relationship, and they did eventually get divorced. And there were all sorts of sad episodes. So he took in a younger man to live with him at one stage, who then ended up stealing various of his treasures from his lifetime. But he didn't actually have very much money by the end of his life. He'd sort of started off from a moderately wealthy background and had used up all his goodwill and good luck by the end of it. So yeah, another slightly sad end after the Boothby affair.
During your research for the book, was there anything that really came up, anything exciting that came up out from the MI5 files or the government papers? Because as we know, a lot of the, the stories surrounding the Krays and other major criminals, I suppose, there's always red tape wrapped around these stories, especially if it involves, high profile people who maybe, want to live their life out before any revelations come out. So was there anything that really sprung out that hadn't been, covered before?
Well, from the MI5 files, not that much that's not in the book. I mean, it really proved the point that there had been this major government conspiracy, in which you had the two prime ministers involved. I had another source who came to me, a very interesting guy who'd spent part of his life spying for the KGB and all this sort of stuff. He told me how he'd been a police officer in the late 50s, and he'd ended up arresting Driberg on one occasion for cottaging, and Driberg had basically been released within a couple of hours, having put in a phone call to one of his fellow Labour colleagues, which turned out was Jim Callaghan, who was also another prime minister. So I suspect Callaghan was fairly deeply involved in the Boothby affair as well. So you kind of had the three prime ministers, present and future, that was proved by the documentation. And there's also, it's not something that I can be definite about, but there was also, I had evidence come up that Jeremy Thorpe, who obviously had his own legal problems in the 70s, and he was put on trial for attempted murder, that he might well have approached the Krays many years earlier in the 60s with the idea that they might have bumped off somebody for him, which I found quite an enticing story.
I mean, there's so many different links, over the years. I've seen so many different things thrown into this story. I mean, people alleging that Cliff Richard had some kind of liaison with the Krays. Well, he was, he sang in the clubs, but I think, it's probably wide of the mark that he was involved in any of this kind of shenanigans.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't have any evidence on that, but that's one of those ones I know. So my contact, the guy who in the 70s was working as a rent boy in Piccadilly, he spent quite a lot of time with Driberg, and he had some terrible experiences with various people, but he actually quite liked Driberg, and he found Driberg an interesting, quite sympathetic character. And he reckoned that Driberg and Boothby in the late 50s used to hang out at a club in Soho called the Two Eyes Coffee Bar, which at that time was sort of like the centre of the rock and roll scene in the UK. So you had anybody who was coming to London and trying to make it would probably at some stage or another be on the Two Eye stage. And it was like you were saying, these clubs were tiny, they're not like the big super clubs that we think of today. These were tiny clubs. And so my contact told me that Boothby and Driberg would frequent there in the 50s, and that was a story corroborated by the assistant manager at the time. It took me ages to find evidence that this story was true, and in the end I did. And you kind of think, well, Boothby and Driberg must have stuck out like a sore thumb there, but that you would have had a roll call of all these kind of people that would eventually become household names going through that club, and you can see how all those worlds just intertwined, and some of them are bound to be fairly innocent acquaintanceships, I'm sure, but also you can see just how these different worlds collided and clashed, and how all sorts of things might have been possible.
Have you seen any of the Kray films? Just, I mean, your research, I presume, you're going to the MI5 files, government papers, etc., and you speak that contact from the 1970s. Sounds fascinating. So, have you watched any of the films? Did you watch any of the films?
Yeah. Actually, my cousin had a little cameo in the original, the 1991. So I watched that when I was very, very young. Yeah, I've seen them all. I mean, I think they're really interesting from the point of view of this book. I've always been quite fascinated by how fleeting all references are to the Boothby affair, really. And that was one of the reasons why I got into my head that I really wanted to write this book, because it seemed to me I kind of like that clash of politics and crime really fascinates me. And it always felt underdone in those films. And even last year we watched, you know, The Crown, the Netflix series The Crown, and Boothby crops up in that a lot, and he crops up basically as the lover of Harold Macmillan's wife, but there's never a mention of any of this other stuff. So yeah, it felt like a gap that needed a bit of filling.
We've got to hope that somebody somewhere, I mean, this has got, for me, it's got BBC drama written all over it. I'd like to think that eventually we might see this being, you know, dramatized, because it's such a good story. It's one of those stories which you quite rightly see in the films is almost brushed under the carpet, ignored, because it's probably not got any blood or guts in it. And it's, you know, it probably doesn't interest the, you know, the kind of, you know, cinema goer who goes to watch these kind of things. But this has got, you know, the BBC have done the Profumo scandal, they've done the train robbery, they've done so many things really well. But I think if anybody from the, you know, from the BBC production department is watching this interview, get yourself onto this book, because it's a fascinating story, and it's one that deserves to be, you know, deserves to be dramatized. And I think with a decent budget, you know, you could get a bloody good actor to play Boothby, Driberg, and Ronnie Kray as well. You know, I think it would be a fun. And of course, it would be good for you, good for book sales. And
wow. Well, you know, if anyone's watching and they want to buy the rights. Yeah, but no, I agree. I do think it's in some ways it's such a crazy story. I think that's been part of why it's been swept under the carpet as well, because, you know, if you read Boothby never mentioned it. He wrote lots of memoirs, never mentioned predictably any of this, but his official biographer basically dismisses it all in a page or two of the book as well. And that's always been the way. And I mean, I read all sorts of things researching this. So there's a conservative history organization that publishes a journal that's kind of like an academic journal. And they had an article in about Boothby a few years ago. And again, that guy, a very respected historian, basically said, there's no substance to this story. And now, particularly with those MI5 papers, but not just that, you know, there's such a wealth of evidence now. It's not a tenable position to pretend anymore that, you know, this was not quite a major event that was swept under the carpet. And, you know, the guy at the National Archives, when the MI5 papers were released, I think he described it as the greatest British scandal that never was. And I kind of agree with it. It's like, you know, if it had
100%. Yeah, I mean, and of course now at auction houses, sometimes, you know, people sell, you know, memorabilia, etc. And there's been numerous Boothby letters to Violet Kray and to Ronnie Kray, Balance Road appear at these auctions. They're all genuine. So, you know, there's no smoke without fire. And I think the photographs are, you know, they're always a key. It's like when we did the research to the Krays coming to Newcastle for our documentary, we, you know, the key factor for the Krays visit in Newcastle is there's numerous photographs of them in and around the city in nightclubs. Again, it's a fascinating story. We put a lot of time and effort, myself and Neil Jackson from Media Arts, put a bit of time and effort into that. And we interviewed a lot of them who passed away now, a lot of what you would call the Geordie Mafia, who all had a different story. Did we get the answer to it? Why they were coming up here? No, but some fascinating stories, which of course, you know, it's all part of our social history on Tyneside, you know. So it's fascinating. I've got to ask you before we finish the interview, the Sherlock Holmes book, what's it about? Because I've got an interest, you know, like everybody, like a good detective book. And what is the Sherlock Holmes book about?
Well, actually, I've ended up writing 4 Sherlock Holmes books. So the first one I wrote was kind of like almost like a reference-y book about all things to do with the world of Sherlock Holmes as the literary figure, but also like the cultural phenomenon.
Yeah.
Then I wrote quite a light-hearted, fun book called How to Think Like Sherlock, which I was asked to do, which sort of has lots of quizzes and mental agility kind of things in it. And I've written another one called Sherlock Unlocked, which kind of looks at lesser known little stories around the world of Sherlock, but possibly the one that is most in line with what you're thinking was I published 2 years ago. It's called the Ardlamont Mystery, and it's about the origins of Sherlock Holmes in part, but it's about a real life unsolved killing from Victorian Scotland. It took place in 1894, kind of when Sherlock Holmes was at his first peak of popularity. And there was it happened on this Scottish estate, beautiful Scottish estate, which I managed to, I spoke at a festival up there earlier, just before lockdown, actually. It's a beautiful place. But this young 20-year-old lad from a wealthy family that were basically down on their luck had been under the influence of this tutor that his father had placed him with 2 or 3 years earlier. And the tutor and the boy, no, the lad, and a third mysterious man who was called Mr. Scott, who sort of appeared one day and then disappeared the next, went out hunting one morning. And the lad, who's called Cecil Hamborough, never came back. He was shot in the head. And there was a huge trial at the time. And 2 of the key prosecution witnesses were 2 doctors from Edinburgh University. And they had basically also taught Conan Doyle when he was studying at the university. And my argument, which I think is a pretty convincing argument, was that he had based the character of Sherlock Holmes on the 2 of them. So it's a really interesting case. So yeah, that was a really good fun one to write. And it's called The Ardlamont Mystery. So Ardlamont is the estate in Scotland. Yeah, so that came out in 2018. And then since then I did this other one, Sherlock Unlocked, which is more like a treasury of weird facts about Sherlock Holmes and the world.
Obviously a big fan.
Yeah. Well, it's funny, when I wrote the first book, I had a friend who's a writer he's in his 80s now, but he said, oh, now you've written one about about Sherlock Holmes, you'll be writing about Sherlock Holmes the rest of your life. No, I've done my book now, but there we go, 4 books later.
It does become infectious writing, certainly. I mean, you've now delved into the murky world of the Krays. Is there another Kray book in here, do you think, or do you think that was a one-off?
I don't know. There were aspects of it that all sorts of things that intrigue me. I'm kind of aware that there are people like you who've had these long associations where you had first-hand knowledge of the twins that I don't. So sometimes I think some of those stories are probably better left to people like you to tell. But it's a world that fascinates me. At the moment, I'm thinking the next book might not be Kray related, but it might be another dodgy politician. So that might be the strand that I pick up from this one.
You've got your work cut out there. You could be on.
Yeah. There's plenty to choose from.
Start modern day. Anyway, Appear on the Gangster is available now. Fantastic book by Daniel Smith. Get it on Amazon. It's through historypress.co.uk as well. I'm not sure whether buying it direct means you get a bit more, but it's well worth the read. And I think you just gathered from the interview, guys and girls, that Daniel knows what he's talking about. So excellent book, well worth a read. Buy a copy or buy somebody who would like a copy now. But Daniel Smith, thanks very much for joining us today.
Thank you very much.